John Morrison challenged the Interstellar Council. The outcome shocked the entire galaxy. They gave humanity one seat on the Interstellar Council. 1 out of 412. And somehow, impossibly, they gave it to me. I was standing in the airlock corridor of the Conclave of Worlds when the full weight of that fact hit me. Not during the briefings back on Earth. Not during the 6-week transit through fold space. Right there, in a hallway that smelled like recycled air and old metal, with the chamber doors 30 meters ahead of me and 11,000 alien observers already seated inside. My name is John Morrison. I was 39 years old. I had been a maritime lawyer for 11 years, a galactic affairs consultant for 4, and for the last 6 months I had been Earth's sole diplomatic representative to the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy. My predecessor had a heart attack during a recess. The one before him resigned after what the diplomatic corps officially described as a breakdown. The one before that simply disappeared, reassigned, they told me, though nobody could tell me where. I had a bad feeling I was starting to understand why. The Conclave of Worlds sat in permanent orbit above a star called Vareth 9, a dim orange dwarf in the neutral zone between the Keth Dominion and the Vreth Collective. The station itself was enormous, a structure the size of a small moon, built over 4,000 years ago by a species that no longer existed. The council had simply moved in after those original builders went quiet. Nobody discussed what had happened to them. The chamber was a perfect sphere, half a kilometer across, with 412 tiered platforms arranged in a great spiral, each one belonging to a different species. Some platforms held dozens of representatives. Some held only 2 or 3. Earth's platform held 1 chair. 1 desk. 1 small rectangular flag with a blue circle on it that looked embarrassingly small compared to the elaborate banners and light sculptures that surrounded it. I sat down in that chair and looked out at the room. The Vreth were directly across from me, tall, slow-moving creatures with 6 long arms and a face that looked like it had been assembled from pieces of several different animals. Their elder, a being called Counselor Varesh, was already seated. He had been a member of this council for longer than human civilization had possessed writing. He did not look at me. None of them looked at me. That was the point, of course. Humanity had joined the council 22 years ago, after the Encounter War, a conflict that lasted 9 months and ended badly for the species that started it. A mid-tier civilization called the Dreth had decided that Earth was an easy target. They were wrong. When the dust cleared, the Dreth had surrendered unconditionally, the surviving council species had looked at Earth with new and deeply uncomfortable eyes, and humanity had been offered a seat at the table. Not out of respect. Out of the same logic that makes you invite a large, unpredictable dog into your house rather than leave it outside where you cannot watch it. We knew this. Earth's government knew this. I knew this. What I had not known, until I pulled up the session agenda on my data terminal 40 minutes before the chamber doors opened, was what was actually on the schedule today. Resolution 7 Omega. The document was 40 pages long. I read it in 32 minutes. I read it 3 times. The 3rd time, I felt something shift in my chest, a quiet, cold sensation that I recognized from the courtroom. It was the feeling of understanding exactly what someone was trying to do to you. Resolution 7 Omega proposed to limit any council member species classified as a Tier 3 emergent civilization, a category that currently contained exactly 1 species, to a maximum of 12 off-world colonies, a total fleet mass of 400 megatons, and a mandatory 30-year moratorium on any new interstellar territorial claims. Tier 3 emergent civilizations would also be subject to quarterly resource audits, travel monitoring, and a communications oversight protocol. The language was careful. The language was polite. The language never once mentioned Earth or humanity by name. It did not need to. I sat in that chair and I did the math. 12 colonies. We currently had 11. That meant we could add 1 more, ever. 400 megatons of fleet mass. We were already at 380. The moratorium on territorial claims would freeze every pending colony application we had filed, including the 6 systems where we already had settlers waiting in orbital transit stations, living in temporary habitats, waiting for authorization to land. The resolution was not a policy. It was a lock. And every species in that room had voted to put it on today's agenda. Including the 3 we had considered friendly. My diplomatic handlers had told me, in 17 separate briefings, that today's session was procedural. That I should observe and take notes. That under no circumstances was I to address the full chamber without prior authorization from Earth's Diplomatic Affairs Office. The authorization process took, on average, 11 business days. The session was starting in 4 minutes. I looked at the single chair on Earth's platform. I looked at the flag. I looked at Resolution 7 Omega glowing on my screen, and I thought about 11 colony ships sitting in orbit above 6 different stars, each one full of families who had packed everything they owned into cargo containers and said goodbye to Earth forever, trusting that the process would work. Then I thought about what the process was actually about to do. Counselor Varesh called the chamber to order. His translator rendered his voice as something low and formal, like the closing of a heavy door. The 940th session of the Interstellar Council will now convene, the translator said. First item on the agenda, Resolution 7 Omega, submitted jointly by the Vreth Collective, the Keth Dominion, the Silhari Union, and 47 co-sponsoring member states. We will now open the floor for formal presentation. The lead Keth advocate rose to begin the presentation. She was halfway through her second sentence when I raised my hand. The room did not go quiet gradually. It went quiet all at once, like a power cut. 412 platforms, 11,000 observers, and every single one of them looking at Earth's platform, where a human being had just raised his hand and was waiting, calmly, to be recognized. Counselor Varesh looked at me for the first time. The expression on his face was not anger. It was something more unsettling than anger. It was the look of someone who has just realized that the small, quiet problem in the corner of the room is not, in fact, small or quiet. I kept my hand in the air. I was not going to put it down. The Keth advocate stopped speaking. The silence stretched. I counted 4 full seconds before Counselor Varesh spoke. The representative from Earth, he said, and his translator gave the words an unmistakable flatness, is reminded that observer protocols require prior formal notification of intent to address the chamber. With respect, Counselor, I said, and my own translator broadcast the words clearly across the entire sphere, I am not addressing the chamber as an observer. I am invoking my right to speak as a recognized member representative under Article 7, Section 2 of the Conclave Charter. Member representatives do not require prior notification to speak during open floor debate. More silence. I had read the charter 3 times in the past 6 months. I had read it again the previous night, specifically because something in my preparation, some instinct I had learned from years of reading contracts and finding the line that everyone else had skimmed over, told me I should know it word for word. The floor, Counselor Varesh said, after a pause that lasted long enough to be a message in itself, is recognized. I stood up. Thank you. I looked out across the chamber. 11,000 observers. 412 platforms. The Vreth elder watching me with those multi-lens eyes. The Keth advocate still standing at her podium, her expression unreadable. The Drell platform, where 3 small gray-green figures sat very still and watched me with what I could only describe as cautious curiosity. Before the formal presentation of Resolution 7 Omega continues, I said, I wish to place on record a formal notice of objection under Article 3, Clause 9 of the Conclave Charter. I heard something happen across the room. Not sound, exactly. More like a change in pressure, as if the temperature of the air had shifted by 1 degree all at once. I had done enough courtroom work to know what that feeling meant. It meant that what I had just said had surprised people who were very difficult to surprise. Article 3, Clause 9 was 41 words long. It stated that any resolution directly governing the biological sovereignty, territorial capacity, or demographic growth of a member species could be formally contested by that species' representative before the vote was called. A formal contest triggered a mandatory evidentiary debate period of no less than 72 hours, during which the resolution could not be voted upon. The clause had last been invoked 830 years ago. I knew this because I had spent 4 days in the Council's public archive system, searching every procedural record I could access, looking for exactly this kind of mechanism. I had found it 6 weeks ago. I had not told my handlers. Article 3, Clause 9, Counselor Varesh said. His translator gave the words a quality I could not entirely read. It was not anger. It might have been something closer to recognition. Yes, I said. Resolution 7 Omega, as written, directly governs the territorial capacity and demographic growth of Earth's colonial program. It therefore falls within the scope of Article 3, Clause 9, and I am formally contesting it. Under the Charter, this triggers a mandatory evidentiary debate period before any vote can be called. The Keth advocate turned to look at Councillor Varesh. Varesh was very still. "The representative is correct," said a voice from across the chamber. It came from a platform I had not expected, the Drell section, where one of the small figures had leaned forward and spoken. Article 3, Clause 9 is still an active provision of the Charter. It has not been repealed. The contest is procedurally valid. A noise moved through the room. Not loud. More like the sound of a very large machine shifting gears. Councillor Varesh looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "The notice of objection is accepted. Resolution 7 Omega is suspended pending formal evidentiary debate. The session is recessed for procedural organization. We will reconvene in 1 hour." The chamber began to fill with sound, the layered, overlapping noise of 11,000 beings talking at once, filtered through translation systems into a wall of murmured confusion and what I suspected was a great deal of irritation directed at the one human still standing on Earth's platform. I sat back down. My hands, I noticed, were completely steady. I found that interesting. 15 minutes later, as I was reviewing my notes, someone appeared at the entrance to Earth's platform. He was a Keth, tall, pale gray, with the flat reflective eyes common to his species. He wore the deep blue insignia of a senior ambassador. He moved with the deliberate calm of someone who had spent a very long time being the most dangerous person in whatever room they entered. He did not sit down. He stood at the edge of the platform and looked at me. "You have bought yourself 72 hours, he said. His translator gave his words a precise, clipped quality. "Do you understand what will happen during those 72 hours? "I expect I'm about to find out," I said. "We will assign 40 advocates from 7 species to build the procedural case against your contest," he said. "We will bury you in counterfilings, procedural challenges, and technical objections. By the time the debate period ends, your contest will be invalidated on procedural grounds and the resolution will pass with an additional amendment removing Earth's ability to invoke Article 3, Clause 9 in the future." He said all of this without any particular emotion. He said it the way someone reads a weather report. "That is how we handle problems," he said. Quietly. Procedurally. And permanently. I looked at him for a moment. He was watching me with those flat, reflective eyes, and I had the clear impression that he was waiting for something. Fear, maybe. Hesitation. Some sign that the weight of what he had just told me was landing. "I appreciate you telling me," I said. That was actually very helpful. He stared at me for another second. Then he left. I opened a new document on my terminal and started writing. I had 72 hours. I was not going to waste a single one of them. The first thing I did was not panic. This is harder than it sounds when a senior ambassador from the most powerful empire in the known galaxy has just explained, in calm and specific terms, how he intends to destroy everything you have built. But panic is a gear that spins without catching anything. I had learned that in a courtroom when I was 26, defending a client against a team of 11 opposing lawyers with 3 times my budget and 5 times my experience. I lost that case. But I did not panic, and I learned more in those 2 weeks than I had in the previous 4 years. I sat at the small desk on Earth's platform and began to think. The Keth ambassador had told me his plan. That was either a mistake or a deliberate tactic to demoralize me. Either way, he had given me something valuable, a list of exactly what I needed to defend against. 40 advocates. 7 species. Procedural challenges and technical objections. An effort to invalidate my contest on form, not on substance. That told me something important. They were not going to argue that Resolution 7 Omega was fair or reasonable. They were going to argue that I did not have the right to challenge it. That was a very different problem, and in my experience, the easiest problems to solve are the ones where your opponent has already told you their entire strategy. I pulled up the full archive of Conclave Charter amendments, all 900 years of them, and started reading. I did not stop reading for 6 hours. At some point, a junior aide from Earth's diplomatic support staff, a young woman named Laura Finch, 24 years old and 3 months into her first posting, brought me a container of reconstituted coffee and set it down without saying anything. I looked up. "Should I contact the Diplomatic Affairs Office?" she asked. "Not yet," I said. "They've already been in contact with me," she said carefully. 3 times. "They want a status report. Tell them the situation is developing and I'll provide a full briefing within 24 hours. She hesitated. "They said, and I'm quoting directly here, that if you do not stand down from the Article 3 invocation before the debate period opens, they will begin the process of rescinding your credentials." I looked at her. She looked back at me with the careful expression of someone who has just delivered a message they personally disagree with but professionally had no choice but to relay. "How long have you been in Galactic Affairs?" I asked. 8 months, she said. "Do you think Resolution 7 Omega is a fair piece of legislation?" She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "I think it's a trap." "So do I said. "Get some sleep, Laura. You look like you haven't rested in 2 days." "Neither have you." "I'm used to it." I picked up the coffee. "And Laura, if anyone from the Diplomatic Affairs Office contacts you again tonight, tell them you couldn't reach me. That's not a lie. I'm going to turn my personal communicator off in about 4 minutes." She allowed herself a very small smile. Then she left. I turned the communicator off, pulled the archive back up, and found what I had been looking for 30 minutes later. It was buried in a chamber protocol document from 600 years ago, a subclause in a section governing evidentiary debate procedures. It stated that during an active Article 3 contest period, the contesting representative had the right to request full access to all council session records related to the subject matter of the resolution under debate. All records, including sealed ones. Sealed records required a council archivist to process the request. It could not be denied without a majority floor vote, which would itself take 48 hours to arrange, well within my 72-hour window. I filed the request at 2 in the morning, station time. At 4 in the morning, a different kind of visitor appeared at Earth's platform. He was small, even by Drell standards, barely 1.5 meters tall, with the wide-set golden eyes and muted green-gray skin common to his species. He introduced himself as Archivist Seelan, junior historian for the Drell Collective. He was carrying a data case. "I saw your archive request go through the system," he said. His translator gave his words a slightly formal, scholarly quality. "I wanted to speak with you before you received the records." I looked at him. "Why?" "Because some of what you are going to find in those records relates to my people," he said. "And I want to be present when a human reads them for the first time. I want to see your face." I pulled a second chair to the desk. He sat down. He was right. What I found in those sealed records, records that the Council had classified under a security tier that had never been publicly acknowledged, changed everything I thought I understood about why Resolution 7 Omega existed. 300 years ago, the Drell had been a thriving, expanding civilization. They had 14 colonies. They had a growing fleet. They had pending territorial claims on 6 new systems. They were classified as a Tier 3 emergent civilization. The Council had passed a resolution capping their expansion. The language was almost identical to Resolution 7 Omega. The justification was stability. The effect was catastrophic. Within 50 years, the Drell's population growth had outpaced their resource base. Without new colonies, they could not expand their agricultural capacity. Without fleet growth, they could not maintain supply routes. Without territorial claims, they could not establish the new infrastructure their civilization needed to sustain itself. Their economy contracted. Their government destabilized. Their population fell by 60%. They had not recovered completely in 300 years. The Council had known. The Council had watched. The Council had filed quarterly audit reports that documented every stage of the collapse in precise, bureaucratic language, and then sealed those reports, and then simply waited for the problem to resolve itself. I read the files for 2 hours. Archivist Seelan sat across from me and watched my face. When I finally looked up, he said, "Now you understand." "Yes," I said. "Now I understand." "What will you do with it?" I thought about 11 colony ships. I thought about families in transit habitats waiting for authorization to land. I thought about the Keth ambassador's flat, reflective eyes, and the absolute confidence in his voice when he described exactly how he planned to bury me in process. I'm going to use it, I said. Seelan nodded slowly. I will support your contest in the chamber, he said. Unofficially, at first. I cannot speak for the full Drell delegation without authorization. But I will speak. That's enough, I said. That's more than enough. I also met, in those 72 hours, a man named Colin Drake, a data broker who worked the gray edges of the Council's information markets, buying and selling access to restricted system logs. He was human, which surprised me. He had been living on the station for 11 years and had no intention of going back to Earth. He found me, not the other way around. You filed for sealed records, he said, appearing at the platform entrance with the particular nonchalance of someone who has spent years being casually invisible. Word travels fast in the archive system. People who pay attention to unusual filings noticed you. What do you want? I asked. Nothing, he said. I want to see if you're actually going to do this. He set a small drive on the desk. The session logs from the original drafting committee for Resolution 7 Omega. Not the official record. The working logs. Everything said before the formal language was finalized. I looked at the drive. Where did you get these? He smiled. The Council has 14,000 staff members. Not all of them agree with everything the Council does. I picked up the drive. The working logs told me one final thing, the thing that transformed my argument from a strong legal challenge into something close to irrefutable. Resolution 7 Omega had been drafted 23 years ago. Before humanity joined the Council. Before the encounter war was even fully resolved. The resolution had been waiting in a drawer for 2 decades, pulled out and dusted off the moment it became politically convenient to use it. The cage had never been about stability. The cage had been the plan from the beginning. I sent Earth one message before I walked back into the chamber. 4 words. Trust me. I am ready. Then I turned the communicator back off, straightened my jacket, and walked through the doors. The chamber was full when I entered. Not just the 412 delegations, every public gallery was open, every observation platform occupied. 11,000 physical observers and, according to the screen above the main entry, a live transmission network reaching 2,000 relay stations across the galaxy. I had been told afterward that more beings watched what happened in that room than had watched any single event in 200 years of recorded Council history. I did not know that at the time. It would not have changed anything. Councillor Varesh called the session to order and announced that the Article 3 evidentiary debate would now begin. He noted, with careful neutrality, that the contesting representative had submitted a formal evidence brief overnight and that the Council's procedural committee had reviewed and approved it for submission. The Keth legal team went first. There were 40 of them, just as the ambassador had promised, drawn from 7 species. They were organized, precise, and clearly very well prepared. They argued that my contest was procedurally flawed because Article 3, Clause 9 required the contesting representative to demonstrate that the resolution in question directly targeted a specific species, rather than applying a neutral classification system. Since Resolution 7 Omega never named Earth, they argued, the contest failed on its face. It was a good argument. It was actually an excellent argument. I had been prepared for it. The lead advocate, a Silhari woman named Councillor Bren, was thorough and controlled. She spent 40 minutes building the procedural case without a single weak point that I could see. When she finished, she sat down with the air of someone who has done everything that was required of them and expects the matter to now proceed as planned. Councillor Varesh looked at me. The contesting representative may respond. I stood up. I had no notes. I had spent the last 20 hours preparing for this in the same way I had prepared for every high-stakes case in my career, by reading everything, thinking through every possible argument and counterargument, and then letting it settle until it became part of how I thought rather than something I had to consciously recall. I spoke for 90 minutes. The first portion of my response addressed the procedural argument directly. I agreed that Resolution 7 Omega did not name Earth. I then presented a comparative population analysis showing that the Tier 3 classification, as defined in the resolution, applied to exactly one currently active council member species based on the specific combination of criteria used. I presented the council's own demographic registry data. I walked through every one of the 37 criteria and showed, step by step, that 34 of them uniquely applied to humanity. I asked the chamber whether a law that, by its own definitions, applied to exactly one group among its subjects could genuinely be called neutral. Nobody answered. I had not expected them to. The question was for the record. The second portion of my response addressed the intent behind the resolution. I presented the working session logs, the ones Colin Drake had given me, showing the complete drafting history of Resolution 7 Omega, including the dates of the early drafting sessions, which predated humanity's council membership by more than 2 years. I read several exchanges from those logs aloud. I did not editorialize. I did not need to. The language spoke clearly enough. At this point, something changed in the room. I could feel it the way you can feel weather changing, a subtle shift in the quality of attention. Several delegations that had been sitting back in their seats had leaned forward. The Drell platform was very still. The third portion of my response was the one I had been building toward for 72 hours. I presented the sealed historical records regarding the Drell Collective. I walked the chamber through the full sequence of events, the passage of the original restriction resolution 300 years ago, the 50 years of documented decline, the classified audit reports, the population collapse. I read from the Council's own internal documents. I quoted the quarterly reports that had watched the Drell civilization contract and said nothing to the broader Council membership, nothing to the Drell themselves, and nothing to any public record that might have allowed anyone to intervene. And then I said the following. I want to be clear about what this chamber did. 300 years ago, this council passed a resolution that it knew, based on its own internal modeling, would cause a civilization-level crisis for a member species. It then monitored that crisis in detail, classified the monitoring records so they could not be examined, and waited for the problem to resolve itself. That is the history of this mechanism. That is what Resolution 7 Omega is built on. The room was extraordinarily quiet. I am not standing here to ask this council to trust humanity, I said. I am not standing here to argue that Earth deserves special consideration or that humans are better or more worthy than any other species in this chamber. I am making a simpler argument than that. I am arguing that this resolution is not what it claims to be. It does not promote stability. It does not serve galactic order. Based on the documented evidence of the last time this council used this mechanism, it does the exact opposite. And based on the drafting records that have been entered into evidence today, it was never intended to do anything else. I paused. The pause was deliberate. I am also making a request. Not for humanity. For this institution. The Council's founding charter was written to protect every member species, not to contain them. Article 3, Clause 9 exists precisely because the founders understood that a governing body of this size could be used as a tool of suppression rather than governance if no mechanism existed to contest it. I am using that mechanism now. And I am asking this chamber to look honestly at what it is being asked to vote for, and to consider whether that is the kind of council it wishes to be. I sat down. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the Drell delegate, not Archivist Seelan, but the senior Drell counselor, a figure who had not spoken in the entire session until this moment, rose to her feet. The Drell Collective, she said, formally seconds the Article 3 contest and requests that the evidentiary record be entered in full into the Permanent Council archive. A sound moved through the room. Then a second delegation stood. The Harith Union, a mid-tier species who had always been quiet in council sessions, formally associated themselves with the contest. Then the Silhari junior delegate, not the lead advocate, but one of the younger members of the platform, stood and stated that she was personally calling for a procedural review of the resolution's drafting history. Councillor Varesh called for order. Order was restored. But the temperature of the room had changed completely. The vote on Resolution 7 Omega was called 30 minutes later. It was a secret ballot, as all final votes were. The results were displayed on the main chamber screen after 12 minutes of tabulation. Resolution 7 Omega, rejected. Unanimous. I counted 11 seconds of complete silence before the room came back to life. 11 seconds. I remember every one of them. There is something nobody tells you about the moment after a major victory. It does not feel the way you expect it to feel. There is no rush of triumph. There is no sudden lightness. What you feel, mostly, is tired, a deep, quiet exhaustion that settles in once the adrenaline drains away, like a tide going out. I sat in that chair on Earth's platform while the chamber filled with noise around me, and I thought about a cup of coffee that had gone cold 4 hours ago and whether the transit station above the 6th contested colony world had a cafeteria that served anything recognizable. Laura Finch appeared at my side. She had clearly been watching the vote display from the observation gallery. Her eyes were slightly red, though her expression was controlled. "They're calling Earth," she said. "The Diplomatic Affairs Office. The director herself is on the line." "Tell her I'll call back in an hour," I said. Laura blinked. "She's the director of Galactic Diplomatic Affairs." "I know who she is," I said. "Tell her an hour." Laura thought about this for exactly 2 seconds. Then she said, "Understood," and went to make the call. I stayed in my seat and watched the chamber slowly empty. Most delegations left without looking at Earth's platform. A few looked, with expressions that ranged from something like respect to something like recalculation, as if they were quietly updating an internal model they had not expected to revise. The Keth ambassador appeared one more time. He did not come to the platform. He stood at the entrance and looked across at me from that distance, and for a moment we simply looked at each other. Then he turned and walked away. He did not speak. There was nothing in his expression that I could clearly read. But he had come back to look, and I thought that meant something, though I could not have said precisely what. It was a transmission the following day that affected me most. It came through the standard diplomatic channel, tagged as personal correspondence from the Drell Collective. When I opened it, it was not a formal message. It was a scan of a physical drawing, the kind made on paper by a child, with the slightly unsteady lines and vivid colors that are the same in every species that grows up drawing. The drawing showed a large circular room and a very small figure standing in it. The figure had 2 arms and 2 legs and was clearly meant to be a human, though the proportions were cheerfully incorrect. The small figure was surrounded by much larger shapes, but it was standing up. All the larger shapes were sitting. There were no words. There did not need to be any words. I looked at that drawing for a long time. The director of Galactic Diplomatic Affairs called me 11 times in the 48 hours following the vote. When I finally took the call, she spent the first 3 minutes explaining, in precise and measured terms, how seriously I had violated protocol, compromised Earth's diplomatic standing, and created an unpredictable precedent in galactic law without authorization. Then she spent 45 minutes asking me to walk her through exactly what I had done and how. I answered every question. I shared every document. I walked her through the archive research, the clause discovery, the sealed records request, the drafting logs, the full chain of logic that had led from sitting down in that chair to the moment 11,000 beings watched a unanimous vote fail on a screen. At the end, she was quiet for a moment. "You should have contacted us," she said. "You would have told me to stand down," I said. Another pause. "Yes," she said. "We would have." I received every commendation Earth's government could formally bestow within 30 days. The ceremonies were brief and the plaques were heavy and the speeches were the kind that sound meaningful in the room and echo a little emptily in memory. I accepted all of it with gratitude, because the people who organized those events meant genuinely well, and meaning well is a thing worth honoring. None of it felt like the point. The point was something Colin Drake said to me the night after the vote, sitting in the small crew lounge 3 decks below the main chamber, sharing a meal that tasted approximately like food. "You know they are going to try again," he said. "Different resolution. Different classification system. Different mechanism. But the same goal." "I know," I said. "So what are you going to do about it?" I thought about Article 3, Clause 9. I thought about the 7 other clauses in the Conclave Charter that I had identified during my archive research, clauses that had never been used, never been tested, never been held up to the light of an actual legal challenge. I thought about the 12-seat limit on Earth's colonies and the fact that we currently had 11, and that every additional colony application we filed would require council approval, and that council approval required a committee review, and that the committee review process had 17 steps, and that I now knew the name, legal history, and jurisdictional scope of every one of them. "I am going to keep reading," I said. That was not the complete answer, but it was the truest one. The complete answer was this: I went back to Earth's platform the morning after the vote and I sat down at that small desk and I opened a new document, and at the top of it I wrote a motion. The motion proposed an amendment to Council membership classification rules. It proposed that the current system of tier classifications be subject to mandatory review every 10 years, with full public access to all modeling data used in classification decisions. It proposed that sealed records relating to any active member species be subject to automatic declassification after 50 years. And it proposed that the number of seats held by any member species be tied to a transparent, publicly audited formula based on population and contribution metrics, rather than fixed by historical negotiation. The motion was not a dramatic gesture. It was not designed to shock anyone. It was 62 pages of careful, specific, fully cited legal language, and it was going to take years to work through the Council's amendment process, and it was going to be opposed by a significant number of the 412 delegations, and there were going to be days when the progress was so slow that it felt like standing still. I filed it anyway. Because here is what I understood, sitting on that platform with Earth's small flag behind me and the vast, ancient chamber of the Interstellar Council stretched out ahead, the most important thing humanity had demonstrated was not that we could win a confrontation. It was that we had read the rules carefully enough to know that the confrontation did not have to happen the way our opponents expected. Every system built by intelligent beings contains the seeds of its own correction. Every set of rules written to govern a community carries within it the mechanisms for challenging those rules, if you look closely enough and care enough to find them. The Conclave Charter was 4,000 years old. No living species had written it. Many of the beings who had shaped it over the centuries were gone. But the language remained, and language is patient, and patient things reward patient readers. They gave humanity 1 seat on the Interstellar Council. 1 out of 412. I had been sitting in it for 6 months when I raised my hand and changed the course of galactic law. I was not done. Archivist Seelan sent me a message 3 weeks after the vote. He said that the Drell Collective had formally petitioned the Council for a review of their historical colonial restrictions, citing the declassified records as new evidence. He said the petition had been accepted for committee review. He said that 3 other species, smaller civilizations that had been quietly watching the debate from public galleries and had not spoken during the session, had filed similar petitions in the days following the vote. He said, "You opened a door. We are walking through it." I replied, "I found the door in your archives. You had already built it. I just needed to find the handle." There is a version of this story where I am the hero. Where one brave human stood up against a galaxy of opposition and won. Where the moral of the story is that humanity is special, that we are stronger or smarter or more determined than the civilizations around us. That version is simpler. It is also wrong. What actually happened is this: a lawyer read a very long document very carefully, found a clause that had been forgotten, and used it. A junior Drell historian decided to trust a stranger with his people's painful history. A data broker who had spent 11 years living in the margins of the galactic information economy chose to hand over records he had been sitting on because he wanted to see what would happen. A young diplomatic aide chose, twice, to do the harder thing when the easier thing was available. 47 council species voted against a resolution that many of them had co-sponsored, because when the evidence was placed in front of them, they could not pretend they had not seen it. A system corrected itself. That is the actual story. And the reason it was able to correct itself is that someone stayed awake long enough to find the mechanism. I think about the sealed records a great deal. Not the Drell records, though I think about those too. I think about what else is in that archive. 4,000 years of council history. Sessions and proceedings and committee reports and classified assessments and working logs and all the administrative sediment that accumulates when a governing body operates across centuries. How many other injustices are sitting in there, waiting? How many other species have a version of the Drell story in their past, a moment where the mechanism that was supposed to protect them was turned against them instead, quietly, procedurally, and buried so deep in bureaucratic language that nobody ever went looking? I submitted a request for expanded archive access 3 days after the vote. The request is currently pending committee review. I am told the committee review process takes, on average, 18 months. I have already identified the clause that allows the review timeline to be challenged on procedural grounds. They gave humanity 1 seat on the Interstellar Council. 1 out of 412. And 1 seat, it turns out, is all you need to start rewriting the rules, if you are willing to stand up in it, and sit back down and keep working, and stand up again the next time, and the time after that. I have got a lot of standing up left to do. I am looking forward to it.